Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the June Ethical Gem Suppliers Sale. We're so happy to have everyone here. So for the morning session, we thought that we would kind of put the questions out there and discuss, how do I buy an ethical gemstone? I'm going to let everyone on the panel do a brief introduction of themselves and go with a question of what your recommendation is, just a quick one, of how do I buy an ethical gemstone? I'll begin with a quick leader from Virtue Gem, which is the project that I'm working on. We work in through mining associations and within source countries of Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi. And the question of what is an ethical gemstone, I think, is different for who we're working with and who our buyers are. So this is how do you buy this is kind of a different, it's a different question for our group. And so when we had recently a buyer put through questions to our suppliers and to our source countries about what they would like to see. They wanted to know about the mine structure. They wanted to know about the environment. They wanted to know what kind of polishing compounds were being used in gem cutting. This was all new information to the gem miners and then the gem cutters, that it was new to them that these were questions that were being asked. So I think that how do I buy an ethical gemstone, I would just say, is something that is a matter of questions and answers. So ask your questions and get your answers. And the more that we can get these questions of how do I buy an ethical gemstone up and down the supply chain, the more progress we're going to make on having responsible sourcing. So there's one perspective. Brian Cook, why don't I hand it over to you?
Okay. I guess there's so many questions that the entire group will go through a lot of it. So I'll just be quick and say that, beyond the obvious of trying to ascertain the provenance of where a stone comes from, that's step one. And then I think you can ask your supplier, what are you doing to engage with the community or your source of stones? And then each supplier can essentially say how they participate with the community. My specific case, I work with a lot of stones from Brazil, but I'm most intimate with the golden rutilated quartz because I actually am an owner of a claim and operate mining operation. So in that specific case, I have very detailed information about where the stones come from, what the conditions are, which varies wildly even in our region, because there's anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000 miners spread across this entire mountain range. But at least I can give my clients and you and anyone interested great detail on what's happening there. So I think that's a good question. How do you engage with your community of miners? And then from there it would go up the chain. So I'll go ahead, I'll pass it on to the next person. I guess we'll go in order of, I don't know, Hewan, let's do you.
That's fine. All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome for our last session for the June event. And we're going to be discussing about ethical gemstones. How do I buy ethical gemstones? I think it's different for everybody, and even the word involves a really broad aspect of what ethical is, and which is we all do in a different way, each of us as a supplier. So, I mean, the question you can ask is, how are we sourcing our gemstones? Brian mentioned, Susan mentioned, as about the origin, is I think usually is the first question. That's what's really we bring into the table, identifying the origin, how we're sourcing, where it's coming for. Unlike the other suppliers, sometimes you have no idea where the stones come from. So that's one thing really you should be questioning about. What's the origin? How do you get it? What's the condition of the mining? How are we engaged into participating and sourcing ethically? What are we doing to the community? Who's involved in it? Another thing is the legal aspect. There should be questions. How do we import or export our gemstones? I think that's one issue been in the gemstone trade, been smuggling from every different countries. I think those are questions you should ask, and about what we do, what we get involved into in the mining community, what we're benefiting, how is our cutting processes being done, who does it. We have the full connection from mine to all the way to the market as we claim. So you can ask us and ask those questions, not only us and other suppliers, to verify those questions. And I can pass that to maybe Monica. You can go ahead.
Thank you, Hewan. Thank you all for being here. And actually, it's a little early on the east or on the west coast for those attendees. So thank you for tuning in. We have our coffee or tea, hopefully, all of us. But I've been recording. I've been writing down so far like what people have recommended, and I will actually probably give that to our website developers so that we can actually maybe put that as a resource, maybe on our website, so that others can understand kind of where we're coming from, because I think there's some really good information here. I'm Monica Stephenson. I'm the founder of Onza Gems, and I'm a collaborator on Moyo Gems. And while both of those have slightly different approaches in terms of how granular we can get to the actual miner or who it's coming from, I think if I were to ask someone or tell someone what to ask, I think looking at country of origin as the bare minimum of what someone could identify. I think you need to understand provenance. You need to understand where something is from. But I think Brian and a few others have mentioned too, how are you either benefiting or engaging the source community? I think that's a really key question. So something to always be asking. It's not enough just to be able to say, hopefully, truthfully, where something comes from. It's also important to know exactly how you're engaging with that community. And then I think the idea of how are you improving your either relationships or your community involvement or development. Just because something was a great idea 2 years ago, it may have evolved or may need to change or adapt now. So, and I think cutting is a big part of a GEMS journey as well. And so understanding where and who cut that and under what conditions. And if you can't even find out the bare minimum of country of origin, or if the export is done legally, to Hewan's point, like I have export documents, for our shipments. And so it may seem like a small thing, but I can say that these gems were actually purchased in country and shipped out legitimately. So some may not even be able to actually kind of identify that. So those would be my recommendations, and I'm going to pass that along to Jay.
Thanks, Monica. Good morning, everybody. I was hoping maybe to be the last one, since I am so detached from source of material. But I'll give you my take based on the position where I am. The business of Perpetuum Jewels is in New York City, and is one of the major centers for jewelry and gemstones. The conversations that I have with my clients, in which I advise them and make recommendations about how to make sure that their purchase is, it's something that it's closely related to their idea of an ethical gemstone, or ethical supplier. Essentially goes back to what Brian puts in as a foundation, which is have the questions ready. If this supplier has a significant level of comfort answering those questions, you're closer to the truth, you're closer to the legitimacy of the sourcing methodology of this person. So generally speaking, and this is, going back to old school mentality, most people will keep their information at heart and not communicate it because of, just traditional mentality about not telling where you get your stuff and who you buy from, because then maybe it's going to hurt your business. But nowadays, the whole paradigm has shifted, and the more information that you have on every step of the journey of that stone, the more informed you give sort of an experience to your client, and your client to the end consumer. So it's in its best interest to communicate all the information that you have. So starting with the questions, getting some comfort, a level of comfort in which you're getting the information that you need. And if you're not getting the information that you need, it's also useful to know why is it a challenge to understand a particular, set of information of where you don't understand where it's being cut, you don't know what it's being sourced. In the size on the side of diamonds, trust me, KP compliance is not enough these days. You have to know more. Where are you participating within trade associations, for example? How are you being represented in the community as a trade participant? It's an important thing. Visiting an office here in New York City, it's easy. You sometimes have 1, 2, 3 people operating. You should be able to see the kind of operation that's there. Is everyone, equally participant in the process? Are they allowed to talk to you? Are they allowed to disclose information about everything? That's a clear message that they have an ethical practice. If you see only the one person and everyone's in the back room, that's not exactly the most transparent way of conducting business. So it's about answering the questions. It's about feeling comfortable with the information that you're given, and starting a good relationship. And I'm sure in the long term, as you establish the relationship, more and more information will be communicated with you. So all right, from my standpoint, I think I can pass it over to Eric.
Eric, you're on mute. Start over.
All right, there we go. Yeah, you got to learn all these things, and 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, it's not the easiest time. So, well, a lot of you have already mentioned things that I think are important. So I will sort of go back to a very broad brush thing here. First, I don't think people can, buyers, makers, jewelers can really engage in this area unless they know what they believe. So I really encourage everybody to write down what you believe, write down what you want to see and what you want to support. And then you know where you stand. So when you go and ask questions, you'll know if those answers meet your goals. The other main point that I seem to be saying and getting quoted lately by Mr. Stuart there is that the gemstones are not ethical or unethical. They're just gemstones. It's the people and the companies that bring those stones to you. And so you really need, like Jay said, to analyze and look at how that company runs and what their beliefs are. Do their written beliefs match yours? If they do, you probably have a partner that you want to then start getting more information from. So it is, like everyone says, a term that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But if you know what you're asking, if you write down your goals and your beliefs, it's a lot easier to ask those questions, and it's a lot easier to analyze the answers that you get. So, Brian talked about community, involvement. So did Monica. Jay talked about openness of companies. Susan talked about, how you work within communities and how you, as a company, help organize and support those. So all those, in my mind, are part of it. But again, one thing that, you can ask your suppliers is, they can help you develop those questions also and develop what, your statement. But one thing that I do, I always say, ask the company what their written position is on responsible sourcing, and then you can hold them to it. So, so all the elements, many people have already chatted about them here. I'm sure Stuart will some more, and Ian will. But for me, it's know what you believe and then act on what you believe. So with that, I'll pass it to Stuart, who we'll see if he's awake over there.
I am awake. I'm just hoping that the technology doesn't let me down. So please make some wave symbols or something, anything to let me know if you can't hear me. So keep the thumbs up until it goes to a thumbs down. Yes, Eric, so I think I'm really glad that you mentioned your point again about the gemstones themselves not being ethical or unethical, but it's all about the people that you're dealing with. That's certainly, I think, I've noticed on social media, not just myself, but other people have picked up on that as possibly being the quote of the fair almost. So we may need to rethink our terminology. Yeah, lots of good points already made, obviously, from the group. I would, obviously there are hundreds of questions that you can ask about, about a gemstone, where it's from, what it is, where it's been cut and mined and how it's been treated, all of those things. And we've already touched on lots of those. So I think probably the main thing I wanted to add that hasn't quite been stated so far is that obviously this kind of discussion with your supplier could end up being quite a lengthy process, because there is so much to find out, and depending on how much of these things, how many of these things are important to our audience as customers, then that could get quite involved. And what I've seen, and I'm sure other members of the group have seen also increasingly in recent times, is that I've been given quite often out documents, so forms to fill in, or some kind of know your counterparty type of process that I've had to go through, and that's absolutely fine. I think that's great. I think that's a real indication that people are taking this seriously. And likewise, if I can't answer those questions, if I get a form from one of my customers and I can't put something in most of the boxes, then that's going to tell them quite a bit about me. Or alternatively, as I hope is the case, I can fill in lots of the boxes and that will also tell them lots about me. So I think that although it seems really formal and maybe something that smaller businesses shouldn't, can't really allocate the resources to, I think a little bit of time and effort into something like that, to put together just a document. There are templates out there. I'm pretty sure that, for example, Sibjo have something now, and there are other resources available, that all of the great things that we've been talking about so far in this discussion can be condensed into a document. There can also be a conversation around that, but at least if I send one of you a document, you fill it in, it gives me a starting point. It means then that I don't have to sit on a Zoom call or something for 2 hours going through all of that with you to start with, but I can then follow up with the conversation. So I think, of course, it also makes it consistent with each of your suppliers, and it means that you don't forget things, because you can take some time in advance to prepare exactly what you want to know. So I think that would be my advice, is that maybe start off with something quite simple, but at least have maybe 10, 15 questions that you think, these are the really important things for me. This is what I want to know. Put those in a simple document, send those to your suppliers, and see what you get back. That is going to tell you quite a story. And I think it connects really with the point that's been made a couple of times, that you do want to see, I hope you want to see from your suppliers that they do have a commitment, that they have bothered to write different policies, or at least make some statements, or even just some blog posts or something about the topics that you care about as a customer. So that would be my my bit of advice.
That's perfect. I think that just leaves Ian maybe to.
Yeah, I forgot to hand over to Ian. Apologies, Ian.
Not a problem, Stuart. Thanks very much. Look, we're reaching the finality, I suppose, of this conversation somewhat. I'm not going to repeat what other people have said. It's all relevant, it's all useful, and it's all very important. There's two things I want to leave here. Firstly, I want to highlight the importance of the development of relationships, and I bang on about this a bit like Eric bangs on about his thing. The development of relationships between each of us, both up and down the supply chain. I think that's fundamental to understand each other's roles and what each of us does in terms of supply, but of securing, but also of provision up the line to designer makers. And fundamentally, relationships build trust, and then trust builds confidence and understanding. So it takes time, it takes work, and it takes, I think, a commitment to actually spend that time, certainly from our perspective, but also from designer makers' perspective, to actually put that time into developing those relationships. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to leave you with, I actually want to leave you with a link, and I'm going to post it here right now. So this link is actually a link to a website called Ethical Making. And now Stuart will know this link, possibly not others know this link. But this link is very important because it's not just about stone sourcing, but it's also broadly about ethical making, and it's a resource base for designers to utilize in a whole range of different aspects of their work. This particular link actually goes to the actual stone sourcing component of the website, and I'd recommend you read through this and take up these hints and ideas that this link will give you. It shifts off to a number of different tabs. When you click it, you'll go to a number of different tabs. And it's something you can read, it's something you can digest. It's basically, it's illustrating what we're talking about here today. And it's something that I can leave you with, and we can leave you with as a group, because there's a wealth of information in this group with all sorts of stuff, with all sorts of ideas. This is another aspect of this, comes from the UK, this group. Really interesting work that's been done here. As I say, I recommend you strongly follow this link. Now, some of us are listed on this link as recommended suppliers, some of us aren't. It merely because it's a UK market, and I'm sure that my colleagues now will want to move into doing something about their own recommendations to move into that space as well. But so I think this is a very important link to have for designer makers, not just for stone sourcing, but more broadly, the whole aspect of making within an ethical framework. So that's really what I wanted to leave today. And I think now I'm passing over to Susan to finalise, I guess.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Yes, I think all of the perspectives have been so helpful, and I just put in the chat that I think it's slightly different when we're talking about how to buy an ethical gemstone than how to buy from an ethical gem supplier. And we started out with some people talking about documentation, and I think that that's an important thing to go back to. There's a level of trust that you have with your trusted supplier, and I think that part of what we enjoy about having these virtual ethical gemstone meetings is that you get to meet the suppliers, you get to hear about what we do with the source countries, what's happening on the ground. And this is really rare. I mean, this is a really great way for not only us to connect with buyers, but you to be able to connect with us. If you're a Tucson shopper, you go through there and, you know, there's crowds around booths. You don't get to ask your questions. You don't get to meet anyone. So I would be a little biased, but I would say being here and going to the tables and talking to everyone and asking the questions is a great way to work with an ethical gem supplier. So thank you.
Agreed. I was wondering as Stuart was speaking, and I think maybe it came up a little bit with Jay about documentation. And I'm just wondering what the group feels about documentation. And, you know, verbally we can say a lot of things. But I also think that documentation can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. Working with artisanal mining communities, you know, the bigger the barriers and like the more you have to check boxes or actually kind of dig in, are we creating barriers for those who might have language barriers, for instance, or they may not actually know how to answer certain questions? I'm just wondering if there's anyone who on the call right now, because at some point, like we get a little, I'm going to use the word Western, like in our kind of Western dealings, we get a little bit paperwork heavy. We tend to kind of want these assurances that might actually come with some sort of, you know, written guarantees, paperwork, blockchain, something to that effect. How, but is there a point where that actually is a deterrent or a barrier for some of our communities to actually then participate in? I'm just curious if anyone wants to maybe talk about that or weigh in just before we dismiss and go to the tables, just to say, okay, what's the next step of, you know, how do we can say a lot of things, but how important is it that we document or that we prove it? And Eric, you sort of come to mind.
I think it's quite important, but I also understand your position. A few of the suppliers I work with are illiterate. They couldn't document it if they tried. But what they can do is still supply you or me with information, and then we have a separate set of books that then we write that down, and who the individual was and how that came to market and what they told us, even if they can't do it themselves. And then sometimes they can do it, but they don't even understand why. They think, boy, if I give you all that information, you're going to go hire a claim jumper and you're going to run my operation next week. Or in my case, they go, well, are you just trying to go around us? So, but what we do in that case, you know, in deference to them, is write down the information we have. It is in a document, and we put it in, you know, whatever kind of electronic or paper file we have for that supply chain. So it is a challenge, but there are ways to work with it to still meet some of the desires of buyers in the West.
I totally agree. And that's a whole new subject. But for example, some of the larger companies spend loads of money in promoting how well they document everything. And sometimes that can even be suspect. gem fields, for example. But I won't go there. But it was interesting. What Eric said is correct. I mean, I can provide GPS points where a stone came from in some cases, but is that really useful? And that brings up the subject of Eric just mentioned. Well, somebody's going to go around us, and this is a question for my ethical suppliers group. How much information can we share, or should we share, when if I or someone has a unique resource, and then by publishing too much information, pretty soon, let's say a Chinese buyer shows up with deep pockets and takes over the whole thing. So that's a question for us, and it's not for the general audience, but I think it's interesting that general audience understands there's a lot of nuances even in our positions. So I know we're running out of time, so come to the tables and we can continue these crazy in-depth discussions.
Just to make another remark about this, look, I think this discussion ought to take place again further. I mean, again, like many of our discussions across the last couple of days, it's not concluded. It's an ongoing conversation, and I think this highlights it. This particular question and those surrounding that highlight the need for us to further unpack some of these ideas and questions. And I think it's fundamentally important that we continue to do this.
Yeah, it'll be an ongoing discussion, and for our industry, what we are doing is something that has not been done before very much, and I think we're kind of like grassroots pioneering individuals that are coming together, and now with our collaborators, who are the folks who buy the gems and make the jewelry, and we're including the retailers as a key component. So I think between all of us, and it completes that big circle I talked about, from the people mining to the people selling, it's one great circle. The more we have these discussions and bring more people into the discussion, the more strength we'll have together. That's my opinion.
Perfectly said. I think that probably is a great note to end on. These discussions are far from over. This is, in some cases, we're continuing conversations that we've started before. In some cases, we'll be continuing these conversations far into the future. So I think just having a conversation is the important part. Illuminating is important. So thank you all, and I guess we can to be continued at the tables. So, and to be continued at future events, and when we can all get together in person as well. So
and there's another session coming up, I think.
At the end of the table time. So now we're going to dismiss and go to the tables, and hopefully see some of your faces there. And then we can also, and then at the end, we have one last session, I believe starting at, it would be 10 a.m. Pacific time, I think. We will have one last session of Ask Me Anything. So if you feel like you have questions that have not been answered through this series of sessions, please bring your questions at that time, and we can kind of go like try to wrap up and answer any questions at that time. So we'll see you at the tables, and then be thinking if there's any last things that you want to ask us in the last session. Okay.
All right.
We'll see you there.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.